cheer for Linsay McCulloch.
Hi everyone, I'm Linsay. Nice to be here tonight. So, in the early 1940s, when America had just joined the war, 5 Hollywood directors volunteered to work for the US Army and the government to make propaganda and to make newsreels. And they were, oh look at that, John Ford, who was known for westerns and had just made Stagecoach. A young director called John Huston, who had just made The Maltese Falcon and invented film noir. George Stevens, who was known for his kind of frothy comedies, including this one with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. A director called William Wyler, who was known for what was known at the time as women's films or melodramas. And so he did Wuthering Heights, but he also made films with Bette Davis. And the 5th director was Frank Capra, who had directed It's a Wonderful Night, It Happened One Night, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and various films like that. And so they were drafted into the Signal Corps, and for the next 4 or 5 years, they were kind of soldiers in the army, ready to make kind of propaganda and newsreels. Frank Capra was the head of the unit, and he stayed in the United States, but all the 4 other directors were sent to Europe and the Pacific to kind of film things there. Frank Capra's role was to make propaganda, and he set about watching some of the propaganda that was coming out of Italy, out of Nazi Germany, including this, which was Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl, who kind of had done this documentary which catalogued Hitler's rallies. When Capra saw this, he was dismayed and kind of dumbfounded at the scale of it, and he said to his team, "I think we've lost this war. We can't compete with this." And so what he decided to do was to make some films that kind of would show the servicemen who just joined up, who until, a couple of months ago had just been ordinary Joes on the street, to show the servicemen, and I say servicemen, it was men in those days, to show the servicemen why we fight. And so he made a series of 7 films called Why We Fight. And he decided in that kind of judo way to use the Nazi propaganda kind of against them. And so the first film, Prelude to War, looks at the difference between democracy and a kind of fascist state, and uses this documentary, this propaganda footage to great effect. He made a total of 7 films looking at kind of key parts like the war in China, so kind of positioning Japan as the enemy, looking at the Battle of Britain and the role that Britain played, looking at the fall of France. And all the way along, he had a very small team. I mean, it was the army, he had a budget, but they couldn't create anything like what Leni Riefenstahl had created. And so he used stock footage, found footage, and the Disney studios did animation to kind of fill in the gaps of those films. But while he was doing that, the other directors were abroad, and John Huston was sent to the Aleutian Islands, which is this kind of strategic post in the Pacific. And the first film he made was a documentary called Report from the Aleutians, which kind of showed the troops that were stationed there, their daily life, what they got up to. There were battles as well, but it was a kind of refueling kind of stop for people. William Wyler, one of the other directors, he followed a crew on a bomber called the Memphis Belle, and so he made a documentary about them. And there was a fictionalized film of this made in the 90s called Memphis Belle. So the footage that was coming back was certainly at the start of the war, very positive, very upbeat. These are our troops in action, very kind of focused on the personalities involved. But obviously, as the war goes on, they're seeing worse and worse things. William Wyler, again, followed another bomber crew around in a new bomber. This one was so loud that he lost his hearing almost permanently. He recovered kind of partial hearing in one ear, but he was a Hollywood director. This was his livelihood. He lost his hearing. John Huston covered one of the bloodiest battles in Europe near Monte Cassino, the Battle of San Pietro. So again, they're seeing kind of terrible, terrible bloody things. John Ford and George Stevens covered the D-Day landings. 10,000 men died that first day on both sides. And the instructions that the filmmakers were given was, don't put yourself in unnecessary danger, but film everything. We want to see everything. So Capra is back home, head of the unit. He's seeing every foot of this footage that's coming back. After D-Day, John Ford returned to America, but George Stevens stayed with the Allied forces that he was embedded with. So although D-Day was like a turning point in the war certainly by no means was over at this point in summer 1944. So George Stevens remains with the army, marches with the army into Germany. And in fact, he's with the troops that liberate Dachau. So he'd gone from Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers to filming the liberation of Dachau. And he said at the time that he was aware that he continued to film. He was aware that it had stopped being a documentary, it had stopped being newsreel, and that this was going to be evidence. And obviously he was incredibly shaken by what he'd seen. Again, Capra is seeing all this footage, every bit of it that's coming back. So what did they do after the war? William Wyler came back, recovered enough hearing in one ear to continue filmmaking, and he made this film called The Best Years of Our Lives. It follows 3 returning soldiers. From the right, we've got Frederick March, Dana Andrews, and on the left, a guy called Harold Russell, who wasn't an actor, wasn't a professional actor. He was a real-life amputee from the war, and he gives this incredible performance. And so this film is, I mean, it doesn't pull any punches. These guys are battle-scarred. They're struggling to integrate. It's a very kind of, for its time, very realistic film about how men might come back and return to normal lives. George Stevens came back and said, with what I've seen, I can never make another comedy. And he didn't. But he, at this point, was editing his film for the Nuremberg trials, and the footage of Dachau would be this turning point at the Nuremberg trials. John Ford only ever made westerns, apart from, he came back from the war and he made a war film called They Were Expendable. John Huston, the last thing he did for the army was to follow a group of, I guess, battle fatigue, shell-shocked, I guess we call it PTSD today. He went to a residential place where men were kind of trying to recover. These were broken men. This was for the army. He was filming this for the army. These were broken men. Some couldn't talk. Some couldn't stop crying. And this film is kind of very much following them around. It's in their sessions with the psychotherapists. It's seeing them getting various kinds of therapy, various kinds of treatment. This was in 1946. Army hated it, absolutely suppressed it, and it wasn't shown publicly till the 1980s. But nonetheless, this is what John Huston's doing. He's seeing these broken men. George Stevens is preparing for the Nuremberg trials. William Wyler's making this incredibly realistic film about the struggle to kind of reintegrate into society. And what about Frank Capra? He's making a Christmas film about an angel. And this is the first film that Frank Capra makes when he comes back. It's A Wonderful Life. Has anybody not seen It's a Wonderful Life? A few? A couple, maybe? So just to give you a quick rundown of the story of this, it's about George Bailey, played by James Stewart. He longs for adventure, but he's trapped in his little town of Bedford Falls. He runs the local community bank, the building and loan. And some money goes missing at some point in the film, and he's facing ruin. Everything in his life is going wrong. He decides that he is going to kill himself. His despair is such that he's going to kill himself. But an angel comes and stops him, and how he stops him is by saying, if you had never been born, this is what life would have been like. And so George realizes that life can be wonderful, and it's a kind of heartwarming film. Well, I say heartwarming because even just in that summary, you'll have seen this is a film filled with disappointment and death and despair all the way through. And I think the war had an impact on that. We're going to look at a clip now, which is the kind of one of the big disappointments in George's life. So all the way through his life, he's tried to escape Bedford Falls, and various things have been put in his way, and they can't. So he was all set to go travelling, but his father died, and he had to take over his father's role. He was all set to go to college, but he couldn't do that, and instead his younger brother went to college, his younger brother Harry. This is the scene where Harry's coming back. Now, the deal was Harry would come back from college, and this would be George's chance to go. This is Harry coming back from the train.
Fields. Wanted man with construction experience. Here's the Yukon. One right here. Wanted man with engineering experience. There she blows. You know what the three most exciting sounds in the world are?
Uh-huh. Breakfast is served, lunch is served, dinner...
No. Anchor chains, plane motors, and train whistles.
Peanut.
There's the professor now. Old Professor
Why, old George, Geographic Explorer Bailey. What, no husky dogs, no sleds? Uncle Billy, you haven't changed a bit. Nobody ever changes here, you know that.
Am I glad to see you.
Say, where's Mother?
She's home cooking the fatted calf. Come on, let's go.
Oh, wait a minute. George, Uncle Billy, I want you to meet Ruth.
Hello.
How do you do? Ruth Dakin.
Ruth Dakin Bailey, if you don't mind.
Huh? Well, I wired you. I had a surprise. Here she is. Meet the wife. Oh, what do you know? Wife.
How do you do? Congratulations.
How do you
What am I doing? Congratulations.
Done it, Harry. You
They're married, these two. Why don't you tell somebody?
I can't wait
Nobody tells me anything.
You really married?
Why, yeah.
Hey, what's a pretty girl like you doing marrying this two-headed brother of mine?
Well, I'll tell you, it's purely mercenary. My father offered him a job.
Oh, we got you in the job. Well, Harry's got running over.
George, about that job. Bruce spoke out of turn. I never said I'd take it. You've been holding the bag here for 4 years, and... Well, I won't let you down, George. I would like to... Well, wait a minute. I forgot the bags. I'll be right back.
Surprise to me. This is the new Mrs. Bailey, my nephew's wife.
How do you do?
Old friend of the Bailey. We're taking her home, and I want to tell you that we're going to give the biggest party this town ever saw.
Harry, I'll be right here. Will you hear How are you?
George. That's all Harry ever talks about.
Ruth, what about this job?
Oh, well, my father owns a glass factory in Buffalo. He wants to get Harry started in the research business.
Well, is it a good job?
Oh, yes, very. Not much money, but good future, you know.
Yeah.
Harry's a genius at research. My father just fell in love with him.
You did, too.
So that's George, trapped again in Bedford Falls. So that's the disappointment, but this is a film that's all about death. In the first 10 minutes, George has to save his brother Harry when they go sledging and Harry falls through some ice. George saves him, but at the expense of hearing in his ear, which means that when the war comes, George is 4F, so even that route of escape, even though a dangerous route of escape is kind of close to George, he can't get away then either. But he saves his brother Harry's life. George, as a young boy, works for the pharmacist, Mr. Gower. This is Mr. Gower and young George. And Mr. Gower, this is 1919, this part of the film. Mr. Gower has learned that his own son has died of the flu, the Spanish flu that kind of went all around the world, global flu. And he's got drunk. And he's made up some medication, but he's put the wrong thing in it, and he's put poison in it. And George realises this. So George, in this incredible scene, which 10 minutes in, I have to say, this is when I start crying every time I see this film. George says to him, "You've made a mistake, you've made a mistake." And the chemist is so drunk, he kind of beats George, hits him round the head until eventually he realises. So 10 minutes in, as a young boy, George has already kind of saved 2 lives. Plus there's another dead son there already. In real life, the actor, to bring this intensity, really got drunk, and he really did whack the boy who was playing young George round the head, unfortunately. George's father dies. He has to stay there. Because he saved Harry, Harry did go to war, and Harry became a hero by shooting down a Japanese kamikaze flight that was about to bomb a troop ship. So thousands of lives were saved. So this notion of kind of death and avoiding death just goes all the way through this film. This was Capra's first film after the war, but it was also James Stewart's first film after the war, and he had been away in the war. He was one of the first Hollywood stars to join up. He joined the Air Corps. He ended the war as a colonel. He ended the war with a Distinguished Flying Cross. He had this kind of incredible wartime career. But he was worried as well that when he came back, he would be forgotten or that he wouldn't know how to act anymore. And his performance in this is such that, is it too far-fetched to say that we're seeing some of James Stewart's own wartime trauma in his performance? Because it's an incredibly kind of spot-on performance about kind of hopelessness and despair. I think it's just wonderful. If George had not been born, his lovely little town of Bedford Falls would have become Pottersville. So Potter is the kind of baddie in this. He's the Scrooge figure. He's the one who's kind of out to get George at every turn. And if George had not been there to kind of stop his rise to power, Bedford Falls would have been Pottersville. Now, in some ways, Pottersville kind of looks great, but the kind of the neighbourhood cinema that was showing The Bells of St Mary's, this kind of hokum starring Bing Crosby as a priest, the cinema that was showing that in Bedford Falls is now a burlesque house, and it says girls, girls, girls. So Pottersville has kind of gone downhill from what Bedford Falls used to be. And so have the people. So in Bedford Falls, this is Bert and Ernie, the cop and the taxi driver, who were George's kind of best friends. And this is how we see them in Bedford Falls. And this is how we see them in Pottersville. Something very much more sinister going on there. And I think that might be a kind of wartime kind of image. It's quite a scary image, I think. And for George, even back in Bedford Falls, for George, even love is desperate and despair. And this is where he kind of announces his love for the woman who's going to be his wife, Mary, played by Donna Reed.
Hello, Sam. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Gee, it's good to hear your voice again.
Oh, well, that's awfully sweet of you, Sam. There's an old friend of yours here, George Bailey.
You mean old Mossback George?
Yes, old Mossback George.
Yeehaw, put him on.
Well, just a minute. I'll call him George.
He doesn't want to speak to George, you idiot.
He does so. He asked for him. George, Sam wants to speak to you.
Hi, Sam.
Well, George Baileyovsky. Hey, a fine pal you are. What are you trying to do, steal my girl?
Well, what do you mean? Nobody's trying to steal anybody's girl. Here's Mary.
Oh, wait a minute. I want to talk to
Here, you.
Rhoda. Tell Mary to get on the extension.
You talk.
Mother's on the extension. I am not. We can both hear. Come here. We're listening, Sam.
Well, look, I have a big deal coming up that's going to make us all rich. George, do you remember that night in Martini's bar when you told me you'd read someplace about making plastics out of soybeans? Chili beans. You remember, out of soybeans.
Yeah, soybean, yeah.
Well, listen, Dad snapped up the idea, and he's going to build a factory outside of Rochester. How do you like that?
Rochester? Well, why Rochester?
Well, why not? Can you think of anything better?
Well, I don't know. Why not right here? You remember that old tool and machinery works? Well, you tell your father you can get that for a song, and all the labor he wants, too. Half the town was thrown out of work when they closed down.
Was that so? Well, I'll tell him. Hey, that sounds great. Ah, baby, I knew you'd come through. Now, here's the point. Mary, you're in on this, too. Now, listen. Have you got any money?
Money? Yeah. Well, a little.
Well, now, listen. I want you to put every cent you've got into our stock. Do you hear? And, George, I may have a job for you. That is, unless you're still married to that broken-down building and loan. Well, this is the biggest thing since radio, and I'm letting you in on the ground floor. Oh, Mary.
Well, I'm here.
Will you tell that guy I'm giving him the chance of a lifetime? Do you hear? The chance of a lifetime.
He says it's the chance of a lifetime.
Now, you listen to me. I don't want any plastics, I don't want any ground floors, and I don't want to get married ever to anyone. You understand that? I want to do what I want to do. And you're...
George.
So that's George trapped once more. And I think the intensity of that scene, what they both bring to it, there was meant to be loads more dialogue, about another page more of dialogue, but they just decided to do it with kind of looks and faces. And I just think it is incredible and great acting from both of them. But again, James Stewart was very, very nervous about that scene. He's like, you know, what if I'm forgotten? And that was Capra's fear as well. What if I'm forgotten? They've been away for 5 years. Films carried on being made. There were other stars. There were other directors. John Wayne didn't sign up. Clark Gable didn't sign up. So Jimmy Stewart is kind of coming back and thinking, will they remember me? And of course, this film is all about what happens when you forget someone, or what happens when someone hasn't been there. When Capra came back from the war, he had been with a major studio before Columbia, but he decided that he wanted some freedom, and so he set up his own film company called Liberty Films with William Wyler and George Stevens, who'd been his fellow directors abroad. So they set up this film together. They wanted to make their passion projects. They wanted to have a lot more independence and control over them. They were all going to make their dream projects happen through Liberty Films. It's a Wonderful Life was the first of Liberty's films. It cost a lot of money. The whole town of Bedford Falls is a set that was built. It covered 3 acres. They built 75 separate shop fronts. They imported real life, full-grown oak trees for the main street. It cost a lot of money. The accepted wisdom is that it flopped at the box office, and that's not quite true. It wasn't a critical success. One notable exception was the Daily Worker, the Communist Party newspaper in Britain. They loved it, and they felt it really showed, kind of laid bare what capitalism could do to somebody. But it wasn't critical success, and it did okay at the box office. And if it had just been a standalone film, okay at the box office would have been fine. But it wasn't. It was holding up the whole of Liberty Films, and it didn't do enough business to sustain that. Liberty Films goes bust. William Wyler and George Stevens don't get to make these kind of dream projects that they've always dreamt of through Liberty Films. But William Wyler, as I mentioned, did make The Best Years of Our Lives. It's a Wonderful Life was nominated for 5 Oscars, including Best Actor, Best Director, Best Film. It lost in every category to The Best Years of Our Lives that year. So Liberty Films was no more. And what happened afterwards? Well, it was kind of not quite the end of Capra's career. He did make other movies, but he couldn't capture the magic. He had been so huge in the 30s. This is why he was heading up this unit in the first place. He was probably the best known director in Hollywood at the time, and he couldn't recapture that magic after the war, after It's a Wonderful Life. Although these days, that's the film that's kind of most associated with him. He made other films, but he'd outlived his success. James Stewart continued to act for the next 35 years, but after that, all of his films, most of his films, I would say, they had this kind of moral ambiguity to them. And so in films like Vertigo for Hitchcock or The Naked Spur with a Western director called Anthony Mann, his characters are kind of darker. He didn't recapture that kind of young optimism that he'd had at the start of his career. It's a Wonderful Life do that well at the box office. That would have been the end of that. But in 1974, its copyright ran out, and due to just a little admin error, that copyright wasn't renewed. So from 1974, this is now a free product. And TV started showing it every single Christmas. And from there, it kind of snowballed and has become the kind of perennial it is now. But it's ironic that a film that's about someone getting a second chance at life itself gets a second chance at life through TV. Just to finish, someone asked me the last time I did this talk, why did Capra make this film? Why didn't he make a war film? And I didn't really have a good answer for it. And so I've been thinking about that. And I think I would say this is his response to the war. It's not just a feel-good film. It is his response to the war. This was what he could do. He was known for kind of community-based films that would bring communities together. I mentioned It Happened One Night, which was a big film for him, really successful film. And it partly invented a genre called screwball comedy, which is all about bringing men and women together, bringing kind of upper class and lower class people together. It's very kind of cementing relationships, cementing community. And it was made in 1934 at the height of the Depression, and the Depression features quite strongly in it. So I think Capra felt, I can bring this country together, I can bring people together again. So rather than just being an escapist thing, I do see this as his response to the war in the way that he felt he could do it. So I've got some notes here. If you've seen the film recently, you'll know that it starts off at this kind of cosmic level. God is talking to one or two of the angels about George and his life. It starts off at this kind of universal level. But then the film goes on to say that one individual can make a difference. And I think Capra, I'm putting thoughts in his head, I don't know if this is what he did think, but I think part of his thinking was, I want to show that after the war, individuals did and could make a difference. And just to kind of resonate with that. The end of this film is set at Christmas 1945, a time obviously when lots of men are returning. And again, I think there is that, things will be different when you come back, but there is still hope. And for me, Capra is just underlining that all the way along. So far from being an escape from the war, this is very much a kind of war-adjacent film. And I think one last thought that I'm putting in Capra's head. People had been so numbed by the war. I think Capra was thinking, I'm going to make them feel again. And I'm going to make them believe that once again, life can be wonderful. Thanks very much.